In any conflict, the stance of the United States is crucial and closely watched. Now, in Yemen, the stance seems to be changing to one of negotiated exit for the embattled President Ali Abdullah Saleh. What's prompted Washington's shift? And if Saleh goes, what will the US be left with in the fight against al-Qaeda? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamahl Sanatamaria. With so many conflicts and uprisings around the Middle East at the moment, it can be easy to miss the little things, the subtle changes which, a few weeks later, can end up being a turning point. Case in point, Yemen. The calls for President Ali Abdullah Saleh to step down have been going on for months. They've only gotten louder in that time. And now we see a statement from the White House with progressively stronger language too. Here it is. The United States strongly condemns the use of violence by the Yemeni government forces against demonstrators in Sana'a, Taiz and Hodeidah in the past several days. The Yemeni people have a right to demonstrate peacefully, and we remind President Ali Abdullah Saleh of his responsibility to ensure the safety and security of Yemenis who are exercising their universal right to engage in political expression. That is the public statement, condemnation of violence, and a reminder to the president about just what his job is. But behind the scenes, there's talk of wanting rid of President Saleh, and a lot sooner than the man himself would like. A report in the New York Times, citing officials from both countries, spoke of Washington pushing for a transfer of power to a provisional government led by the vice president until new elections could be called. Remember, President Saleh himself has only spoken of leaving the position by the end of the year, which is vague, to say the least. So we're going to talk about this issue and the wider issue of US-Yemeni relations in relation to the fight against al-Qaeda. We have got, joining us from Washington, D.C., Shiraz Maher, who is a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College London, as I say, in Washington, D.C. for us. And on the phone from the Yemeni capital, Sana'a, is Hakim Almasmari, the editor-in-chief of the Yemen Post. Thank you for your time, sir. Mr. Hakim, I'll start with you. Where do you think the US stands at the moment? These are reports which are going back and forth. Do you think the US wants rid of President Saleh quickly?
From the sources and the information we have, the US does not want Saleh to leave office immediately. They fear if he leaves, the opposition could take power, and the opposition does not have a strong stance for the U.S. Therefore, the U.S. is trying to stall the opposition from getting power until it assures that its policies and interests are in favor of Saleh leaving. From the information that we received, the Gulf, the GCC initiative, was also a U.S. idea to begin with, to try to give more time until the U.S. can make sure that its fight on UAP, al-Qaeda in Yemen, does not or is not harmed or does not reach the opposition, because the opposition today in Yemen deny that al-Qaeda is an issue in Yemen and is not an issue at all. The U.S. believes the opposite, which al-Qaeda is a threat. Now, these differences between the opposition in Yemen and the U.S. has given the U.S. a lot of worries that they would not be able to take care of al-Qaeda or to fight al-Qaeda if needed by them. This is why the U.S. wants to make sure that Saleh's followers could stay in power or should stay in power, and in a specific his son or nephew, at least until year end, until the matter is settled and the matter is clear.
But would you agree that the talk towards President Saleh is getting tougher because the United States, under pressure from the people in Yemen and from the international community, can't just stand there while people are killed in Yemen and not say anything?
The strong stance by the U.S. has been the same stance that it took in Egypt and in Tunisia. Yes, it came. The protesters have been in the streets now for over 3 months, and the U.S. pressure on Saleh was 3 months late, while in Egypt the U.S. interfered in 15 days. The U.S. is late for a reason that it does not trust who will come in power next. The U.S. talking right now and saying that it wants Saleh to leave power, this is not accurate. What we believe and the action on the ground, the opposition in Yemen as well is not confident with the U.S. initiatives and plans for the next Yemen agenda. That is why we believe that they will not force Saleh to leave, at least for weeks to come, until they ensure that their agenda is not harmed when Saleh leaves.
Okay, so Hakim Almasmari there in Yemen telling us that perhaps the US has got some other interest and would rather see President Saleh stay. Let's see what Shiraz Maher thinks in Washington, D.C., because what we've just heard there from Yemen really contradicts a lot of the external reports.
I would tend to agree with a lot of the sentiments there. The United States is caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, it can't be seen to be opposing demonstrators on the ground who are representing a popular movement to remove a despotic regime and to some extent replace it with some kind of democratic and more representative system. On the other hand, the United States is paralyzed by fear, rightly so, by the threat posed by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which has shown itself to be a very potent threat. And the longer this stalemate continues in Yemen, the American administration and Obama become far more paranoid and concerned about the threats to US strategic interests. On the one hand, they have been fighting a proxy war through Yemeni troops and through drone strikes in parts of Yemen to strike against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And now those resources are being diverted. Saleh is calling them back to prop up his regime. So the fight against al-Qaeda is taking a blow. And at the same time, they can't allow a power vacuum to exist. You run the risk of having a failed state in the Arabian Peninsula and a failed state that is very close to the Horn of Africa, where other terrorist groups such as al-Shabaab are growing. So the position for the United States at the moment is very complicated and very complex.
The thing is, both you and our guest in Yemen have looked at the big picture, and that's quite right, because the fight against al-Qaeda, and we'll go into that more later. I'm wondering about the more acute issue at the moment, the issue that, as I said to our guest in Yemen, people died at the hands of government supporters, and it's difficult for the US to then not say anything. And in effect, people are looking to the US to really start condemning and saying, we want you gone, just as the pattern has followed in Egypt and Libya before.
Well, in Egypt, I think, as you point out, that was precisely the case. And a lot of these regimes in Yemen, in Egypt, in Libya, as they've tried to cling on to power, they've become increasingly brutal against their own people. And in Egypt, I was there in Tahrir Square, actually, on the day when Mubarak sent his people in to start the extreme violence that took place on the Wednesday and the Thursday. And you saw at that point the US position became much more complicated. It's similar in Yemen. As this violence intensifies against protesters, it can't be seen to be supporting that. So the US has tried to walk a very difficult tightrope at times. On the one hand, propping up these regimes, supporting them so that they don't collapse immediately and leaving a dangerous power vacuum, but at the same time having to condemn not just human rights abuses, but the actual massacre of civilian protesters.
Hakim Almasmari, let's go back to you on the phone from Sana'a. Tell me what you think the view of the people is in Yemen towards the United States. You get the view in the Middle East at the moment that a lot of the people, I'm not talking the governments, the people look to the United States for support when they have problems with their government. Is that the way Yemenis view the United States as well?
This is how Yemenis are still viewing the U.S. Protesters feel confident that the U.S. will interfere and stand in their favor. But every day that passes and Saleh is still in power, this hurts the U.S. image in Yemen and makes people feel that the U.S. is not after the people's will and is not after what the people want, but is basically looking for its own agenda and how it could solve its own crisis before Saleh leaves power. Every day that he stays in power will only hurt the U.S. more, not only today, but also in the future, because the opposition today in Yemen, all sides, and the opposition and those who oppose Saleh, feel that the U.S. is not being sincere with them when dealing with this matter. And these people are the ones who are believed or are expected to rule Yemen starting from months to come. So the U.S. has to really consider how it deals with these oppositions who will be the future rule of Yemen.
But here's the issue, which I want to put to you, is that you're saying people are looking to the United States and with each passing day it hurts their image because the United States is having to look out for its own interests. Of course the United States is having to look out for its own interests. Any country does do that and is very wary of getting involved in other people's conflicts.
I do agree with you completely, but they believe right now that the U.S. is looking for their interests as well as the Yemen interests. But by time that passes, they start to believe that the U.S. did not care whatsoever about the Yemeni people's interests and only cares about its own interests. So the image will change from this perspective, that they will start believing that the U.S. does not care about the protests, about revolution, and does not care if people are dying or living. and are only caring about its own agenda, whether people die or live or stay under the sun months or for days.
Shiraz Maher, just a quick word from you. I mean, to play devil's advocate completely here, it's not necessarily the United States' job to look after everyone else. I think that is the way it is viewed. All these people look into the United States for their support and their condemnation, but in the end, it's not actually their job.
No, and to some extent that's part of the debate here amongst people who are saying the United States shouldn't be getting involved. But you've got to bear in mind, these are not countries with which the United States has no relationship. The United States is deeply invested in Yemen, as it is across the Middle East, and therefore it does have a relationship there. And again, I would echo the sentiments of the other contributor when he's saying, as time goes by, people are becoming much more frustrated. And actually, this is the real danger here, because as people become more angry, again, as I encountered myself when I was watching the revolution in Egypt, people were saying, hope, change, these things were okay for Obama, they were okay for America, but what about us? Why are our aspirations not being supported? And unfortunately, as time goes by, as every day goes by, people do become more frustrated, and that's allowing, actually, again, the terrorist groups and the Islamist parties out there to say, look, no matter what you call for, no matter how you protest, even if you're Democrats and secularists, the American administration and Americans will never trust you because you're Muslim. And that's a very dangerous precedent to allow to be projected by those organizations. But of course, that's precisely the kind of narrative that they want to spread. So the current situation in the Middle East is not necessarily the way the Americans or the British or the West per se would like to see it happening and evolving, but the reality is it is happening now, whether we like it or not. This popular sentiment revolution is spreading across the Middle East, and the ground is literally shifting beneath our feet, and we need to find clever ways to back this now and ensure that the right people, Democrats and secularists, are winning in those places.
Gentlemen, let's just pause for a moment. I want to bring you a couple of bits of information, some quotes, which I think illustrate this change in policy. Robert Gates, first of all, Defence Secretary, was asked what President Saleh's departure would mean, and he said, "We've had a lot of counter-terrorism cooperation from President Saleh, so if that government collapses or is replaced by one that's dramatically more weak, then I think we'll face some additional challenges out of Yemen. There's no question about it. It is a real problem." That was March 27. You fast forward to April 5th, and what starts off as a similar tone from the Pentagon changes dramatically. Have a listen.
Yemen is a major concern to us, has been for years, because of the presence of al-Qaeda there and the threats that have emanated from there. We have worked hard over the past several years to try to increase the Yemeni government's capacity to deal with that threat in their midst. Obviously, the situation right now is a difficult one. The longer it festers, the more difficult it becomes. That is why this government has been urging a negotiated transition as quickly as possible, and hopefully, as that takes place, we will be able to better collectively go after this threat that exists in Yemen.
Shiraz Maher in Washington, D.C., that's the direct change there, isn't it? You've got Robert Gates one moment saying this would be quite difficult for us if President Saleh was to leave. And now this shift where the spokesman from the Pentagon there is saying we're looking towards a transitional change.
Again, I think it's an acceptance of the reality. These protests are not going away. They've been on the streets for months. The momentum is building. Pressure continues to build. And the United States can't afford to alienate those people on the ground. And I think this is not something that's entirely unique for the United States in a much more controlled fashion, of course, but in Pakistan, which is another very important and strategic ally of America, where it's prosecuting a war as well in the tribal areas. Musharraf, obviously, who was a loyal ally, who worked very closely with the United States, did step down and Zardari came to power. So it's not the case that the United States has never had to deal with a change of administration. As I say, it was, of course, much more orderly by relative standards in Pakistan. But again, in Yemen, I think now that there's probably very serious discussions taking place behind the scenes to negotiate this kind of transition and looking into the kind of transition that will need to take place. And the other point I would make is, of course, that the United States should also be looking to Yemen's northern border, to Saudi Arabia, which I think can play a much bigger role than it currently is doing in Yemen. And of course, Saudi interests are at this moment perfectly aligned with American interests in keeping Yemen stable and preventing it from collapsing into the abyss.
Hakim Almasmari on the line from Sana'a. I don't know if you heard earlier the soundbite we played, but it was the Pentagon spokesman in my mind, certainly showing this shift when he said that what we're looking for is a negotiated transition as quickly as possible. I mean, when you hear that, do you still believe that the US doesn't want President Saleh out quickly?
As quickly as possible could mean 2 days or 2 months. That is why their stance is not clear. And time will show and prove that as quickly as possible is not quick. When they say as quick as possible, until they reach the agreements that they want to reach. Every day people are dying in Yemen. Every day blood is being shed in Yemen. The international community must interfere to help the crisis. Yemen is witnessing every day issues that have not been seen, and protesters have been there for 3 months, not for days or weeks. The U.S. should understand that it cannot stay quiet and cannot give in to Saleh's demands. And his sons and nephews, if they were responsible for any of these massacres, should be held accountable, and not be giving gifts or special services as they stay in power after Saleh falls. His relatives cannot stay in power. They are behind these massacres, and they have to go with Saleh. The U.S. has to find other issues or other people who could help in serving their policies in Yemen, but not through the Saleh family. This family has been, it's not welcomed anymore by the millions who are protesting in the streets today.
Gentlemen, let's move on more widely to the fight against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. You've both touched on it, and it is clearly a very big part of what the US says and does, both publicly and privately, in Yemen. Shiraz Maher, yes or no, is the US better off with President Saleh in this fight against al-Qaeda, or actually better off without him?
It's impossible to answer as a yes and no. The reality is Saleh is going. The people don't want him. He's gone. And I think, you know, if looking at it from a policy position, if I were advising the White House or if I were back in London advising people there, I would be saying very clearly, you have to accept he's gone, he's finished, and we need to start looking at how best we can adapt and react to the situation.
Let me challenge that, Shiraz. Sorry, I'm going to jump in. I refer to...
Sure.
Something which came out in WikiLeaks a while ago, where the cables quoted President Saleh speaking to General David Petraeus as saying, "We'll continue saying the bombs are ours, not yours." Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that the kind of ally you almost want? Someone who's willing to take a hit for you and let you, in this case, the United States, go in, attack al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and do so with the president saying, "Oh, actually, they're our bombs, not yours."
I mean, that's been going on for years, and not just in Yemen. Again, in Pakistan, it's a very similar agreement where there's this cover being provided. But as I say, transitions have taken place in other parts of the Muslim world where the United States is currently fighting al-Qaeda. And the reality is the world is changing around us. The Middle East is convulsing, and the great danger is, and I think this has certainly been the case in DC and back in London, that too many people are simply trying to resist this change that is taking place and trying to keep looking at the world the way it was. It is changing, and policymakers need to very quickly adapt to that new reality.
Hakim Almasmari on the line from Sana'a. What's your view on the help, I guess, that the United States has gotten from President Saleh? I mean, if he goes... And Shiraz Maher is saying he will go, it's just a matter of time. Surely that makes the US's fight against al-Qaeda more difficult.
I do agree with some of the U.S. policy stances that they should not trust the opposition completely with the al-Qaeda following Yemen. But this does not mean that the Saleh regime has been very loyal to the U.S. in fighting al-Qaeda. From what we've heard and what we've seen, the Saleh regime is only helping the U.S. for the money that it is receiving. There's no real fighting of al-Qaeda on the ground when it comes to reality. Very, very, very few have been captured over the last 2 years from AQAP, as well as all the raids that have took place in Yemen has not killed any senior al-Qaeda leaders. Maybe one at most.
So in other words,
a failure.
In other words, everyone's getting what... Sorry to interrupt you. In other words, everyone's getting what they want. The US can go in and attack under the Yemenis' cover, effectively, and the Yemenis can get funding and assistance, but not put it towards that fight.
The U.S. wants assurances that it can fight AQAP in Yemen if it needs to, and it needs the opposition to say that. The opposition is not willing to completely agree with the U.S. fight on terror here in Yemen, and that is why this crisis is continuing and Saleh is still in power.
Forgive me if you have to repeat yourself here, but why is the opposition not saying that?
The opposition is not saying that because it said clearly beforehand that it does not believe that al-Qaeda is a threat in Yemen, and it does believe that Saleh is the main supporter of al-Qaeda and has been giving them weapons and funds. This is according to the opposition. I'm quoting their spokesperson as saying that. And the U.S. is saying that if Saleh was at least saying directly that he will fight them, he's a better option than someone who's saying that they do not exist or are a very, very small minority in Yemen.
Shiraz Maher, your thoughts on that? From what Hakim Almasmari is saying there in Sanaa, the opposition's not interested. They're saying al-Qaeda is not really a threat. If any opposition were to get into power, that's going to be a huge mess for the US there.
I think it would be, but I think a lot of opposition politics is also about big gestures and big posturing. And of course, as popular sentiment, nationalist sentiment continues to grow, you'd be absurd to deny your own people that kind of rhetoric. I mean, look, again, I'd use the example of Pakistan because it's a country where we've seen that kind of change. There's heavy anti-US rhetoric, heavy anti-US sloganeering and stuff, particularly at election time. But it's not a smooth relationship, but it's a functioning relationship at some level, and America continues to prosecute its interest there. I believe the same will happen in Yemen. I would be amazed if there weren't closed-door, behind-the-scenes meetings taking place right now in Yemen with these opposition figures and members of the U.S. administration. And there's another point, I think the broader point that was being made as well, this idea that Saleh has allowed this massive campaign to take place against AQAP. We need to assess just how effective US measures have been there. I mean, as you already heard, the senior leadership of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, it remains intact. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula continues to launch pretty brazen attacks against US interests, Omar Farouk Abdul Muttalib being one example, the cargo plot being another one, and against Saudi Arabia, there was an attempt to kill members of the royal family. So this is perhaps the most potent and virulent chapter of al-Qaeda anywhere in the world at the moment. And the idea that somehow Saleh has allowed us to significantly undermine them and get in there is just not true. So Saleh has not really delivered much in that sense, and I think, as I say, we need to start looking at how we can better adapt now to the situation as it changes around us.
Gentlemen, starting to run out of time, so some final thoughts from both of you. First to Hakim Almasmari in Sanaa. Where do you think this US stance will go to from here? We've seen, I think, despite some differing views on this program, I think we have seen a change in the US position. How long do you think before it hardens even further into what we've seen previously in the Middle East?
I do not believe or expect the U.S. policy to force Saleh to leave power until its demands are met by the opposition or until they get assurances that their policies will not be harmed in Yemen. Whether this takes 2 days, 2 weeks, or 2 months, it's up to when it will be agreed on, and the U.S. is not really desperate for change right now, because it is thinking that it cannot change Saleh until the options they see for the future are better than them. And I don't blame them for that.
Shiraz Maher, your final thoughts then. How long till, I mean, again, probably not a question you can directly answer, but how long till we see the US saying, President Saleh, you need to leave?
It'll be slower moving than it was in Egypt, and I think everyone's more concerned at the moment with what's happening in Libya. And so the sense of momentum, although it's very strong and concentrated, of course, in Yemen, the US, I think, is going to continue to operate with extreme caution there. And I mean, I would be surprised. I'm not going to get into the realm of making predictions, sure, but I think it will take a longer time there than it has in other parts of the Middle East.
Shiraz Maher from King's College London joining us from Washington. Thank you for your time, sir, and also Hakim Almasmari, who was on the phone from Sanaa, the editor-in-chief of the Yemen Post. That's your Inside Story for today. Thank you for joining us. You can send us your comments and suggestions if you like. Email them, insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team, it's goodbye for now.